my pleasure and honor to introduce Elaine Willman as our next speaker, and the topic's going to be water policy, the bigger picture. And I'm going to read here, she is a community developer, planner, and university faculty member in public and business administration. She's pursuing a doctoral degree in federal Indian policy and is of Cherokee ancestry. Willman lives within an Indian reservation in Washington State. Montana. Is that still true now? Montana now. Okay, which Indian reservation? Flathead, within the Flathead Indian Reservation. And with that, I have heard Elaine now for years. I love hearing her speak. We are very honored to have her here today. Since the last time I think we brought you out here, we had a bunch of protesters in Skagit County, so that was exciting. But it looks like it's a pretty mellow crowd out here today. So with that, I want you to help me welcome Elaine and what she has to say.
Thank you, Glenn, and I think I'd first like to thank Glenn Morgan and Cindy Alia and Cindy Zapatoski and whoever pulled this gathering together. I speak to community groups all over the country, and my favorite place to be is at a CAPR meeting, because the members of CAPR are informed, they're engaged, they're courageous, they're aggressive, and they ask good questions. And I just can't wait to share and stay connected with the CAPR groups. As a matter of fact, Montana doesn't have one, and I think we're going to see about forming one in our area. So we're just true supporters of everything CAPR stands for and all the work they do. And I believe CAPR is only coming up on 15 years old. So I see you as teenager maturing because in my view the next 15 years in this country is where the rubber hits the road, and we have to all get even busier. I'd also like to just acknowledge Laura Lee O'Neill, your videographer. Laura Lee is making this whole conference available on video for all the CAPR groups. Brilliant on these issues, but she doesn't like to talk. But she's one of those huge background players and helpers. There's always something each one of us can do. And then one quick commercial before I start. On the back of the table in the back, I have the two books that I've written, Going to Pieces, which is the road trip across the country, across Indian reservations. And that book was published in Washington, D.C. in 2005. We're now 2017, and that book is selling as well, if not more, right now than when we first came out with it, because all the stories that the people, the tribal members, the sheriffs, cattlemen, farmers, teachers that live on the Indian reservations we visited, all the things they were worried about in 2005 are right here in our face today. And so that's a good background. It's a good story about these two wacky women that made this trip, but you get accidentally educated on Indian policy. The second book, Slumbering Thunder, I put out last year, and it's a collection of work that I've done with community groups, and particularly the village of Hobart, Wisconsin, where I was their community development director and director of tribal affairs. Probably the most dynamic professional experience I've had, because with my left hand I got to help them really develop their community, and with my right hand I got to help them defend against a very aggressive tribe that whose attorneys had gone into the elected council meeting and said, prepare to become extinct, we're taking down your village, you know. And one of the board members found Going to Pieces online and made copies of chapters, invited me out, and it was that book that they were the first municipality I'm aware of in the country where all 5 of their elected officials stood up and said, no more, we're a state subdivision, we have rights, our people have rights, we have authority, and they pushed back. And they took serious heat from their neighboring Green Bay and all the other communities about, that Hobart just can't get along with those poor Indians. So I did a little quick research when I got out there, and those poor Indians' annual operating budget in 2008 was $573 million. You know, Hobart's annual operating budget, full-service municipality, 21 square miles, their annual operating budget was right around $4.5 million. And they were accused of not being able to get along with those poor Indians. while they were being confronted by the tribal legal council with, we're taking it down, we're taking this municipality down. Something quite similar was attempted in Skagit County with my very favorite friend, Brian Lattisby. He was just in front of microphones and newspapers and just putting out that they were bullying Skagit County the way the Oneida tribe in Wisconsin was bullying the village of Hobart. And it is bullying. It is absolute bullying, political bullying, jurisdictional bullying. And so we have to, as individuals and as communities and jurisdictions, say, oh no, you don't. You know, when we stand on the law, we win. And so, anyway, I kind of like to start, because I've been listening all morning and I'm in really good company with these wonderful speakers you've had. And you kind of set the stage. I am not a water expert. I am not an attorney, although I did go to law school for 2 years, just enough to be dangerous, you know. And I'm also affiliated with many organizations, but I don't speak for any of them. I speak just based on my own research, my own experiences, and as an author of my own work. So I'm not speaking for anybody but myself. And I'd like to start at a kind of a higher level on this subject of water. My first thought is that Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, the whole Northwest has absolutely abundant water. Abundant water. Always has. Always will. You know, there's a sign out in front that says, stop the phony water crisis. This is all a political game. But it has forces far more serious than state forces or just tribal forces. It has much more. So I would like to start at what people call the 40,000 foot level. I'd like to start with UNDRIP. Isn't that a great acronym? UNDRIP, U-N-D-R-I-P. UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. UNDRIP. This week is the 10th anniversary of UNDRIP. And UNDRIP, this Rights of Indigenous People, Declaration of the United Nations, includes in its language the obligation and authority to return all Aboriginal land back to the indigenous people. Well, now think about that. That's the entire North American continent, you know. Return all Aboriginal land back to the indigenous people. That's UNDRIP. Your former president signed that puppy. Fortunately, Congress won't touch it. It really has no force in effect, but they've been pushing on it for 10 years, and they're getting closer and closer all the time. That United Nations and international process is coming down so hard on the United States. It's so, in terms of confiscating natural resources, our water, you know, intertwining with these quasi-dependent tribal governments that are not separate sovereigns, although they'll tell you they are. And this whole international system of Agenda 21 under United Nations is partnered up with a couple of other beasts. One are your international environmentalists, international environmental NGOs, and our national, you know, our favorite fun folks that just turned 68 major forest fires in Montana, you know, protecting the poor habitat. You know, now we have 68 forest fires in Montana and crispy critters and no habitat. Yeah. You know, those wonderful environmentalists have just done a swell job, and will be decades coming out of that, same way in Oregon and Washington. You guys know about that. But the United Nations and Agenda 21 forces, the environmental groups, and the deep state of this country, the deep state. We have elected officials in the Senate, in the House. We have bureaucrats throughout the 29 federal agencies whose allegiance is not to the United States, they're adversarial with the United States. And they're certainly adversarial with our current president. He has only one source of support, only one. The international milieu, our national, he went in there and we put him in there to clean house, and he terrifies everybody, just terrifies them. His only one source are the folks sitting in this room. His only one source are the citizen activists, those silent little folks that went to the polls, just sneaked up into the polls and voted, and just took the Electoral College by a large margin. And it was terrifying for all of these groups, United Nations, Agenda 21, the deep state in this country, and many senators and congressmen, even state legislators, are all into that, the one world order. If you look at the mapping for Agenda 21, you will not see the 48 states on their maps. What you see are about 6 or 8 UN regions where the 48 states used to be. It's now Agenda 2030, and that's the game plan. So the tribal governments and the Indian reservations are very convenient pawns and tools for this process. Along with that, under the former administration, President Obama, and this really goes back even longer and farther in terms of taking down property rights in this country. This really starts with a quote, maybe even sooner, but I read a quote not too long ago from Charles Lindbergh Sr., not his son that flew across the Atlantic, but the dad, the father, Charles Lindbergh Sr. He wrote a book, and within one of the first few pages of that book, he says, he was a communist, he says, we must be done with property rights in the United States. People are easily controlled if they don't own property. That was 1930, you know. So this has been going on and on. But more recently, under the past 8 years under President Obama, we elected him to transform America. And he really has. That administration really has. And the ones that suffered the most under those 8 years are the Western states. Western states just went after him. He used water as a tool to take down food production. He used the Endangered Species Act to wipe out the entire San Joaquin Valley that used to be millions of acres and 20% of our food production. The San Joaquin Valley in Central California is now no production, no food production. He used EPA to expand the reservation boundaries of the Wind River in Wyoming to include the breadbasket, the agricultural area of Wind River. The state of Wyoming is fighting that nicely and winning. But he went after food production using water as a major tool. Most of your Indian reservations in the Northwest are ag economies. The Yakima, where I live on the Flathead, except for your small reservations on the western coast. Your Indian reservations in the Northwest are a prime food production area for cattle and food. And they've been under assault, absolutely under assault for years, in this transforming of America. So I'm probably going to sound like Debbie Downer on some of the information I'm going to give you, but you must keep in mind that there's a counteraction that has been enormous. And the counteraction is us. The counteraction to the devastation of our economy and our homes and all things important, the health care, everything, under the former administration was going to the polls on November and changing the game. And we did that. We all did that. The counteraction, even in Alabama recently, when they piled all the money in on Luther Strange, and Alabama said, no, we're done with it. We're done with all this. We want to get back to a constitutional republic. We want the Trump agenda in place, and they went for Roy Moore. You know, against all the money, all the odds, even Trump's endorsement. We did that. The folks in Alabama did that. More recently, we had the statues, the Confederate flag, all that hullabaloo about knocking out. Even Dallas School Board is determining whether or not to remove George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin from the history books of the Dallas Unified School District. You know, now that news has been leaked out, and that probably won't happen because of us. You know what I mean? We're back and we're pushing back. We're really pushing back. And then, of course, we have this fun NFL. We spent 8 years in Green Bay. You can't spend 8 years in Green Bay without being a die-hard Packer fan. We have 2 flagpoles out in front of our property, and an American flag and the Packer flag. My daughter has the Packer flag at half-mast. You know? And the whole city of Green Bay, who owns that wonderful team, has really been upset with their tinkering with it. And so, look how quick and fast that forgotten man and woman, we have pushed back on the NFL. So I use those examples because what we have to push back on here to get our water back and to get our state sovereignty back is really significant too. And it's going to take more of us talking to each other, doing all we can. You have the Fish and Wildlife with their Endangered Species Act. I think I mentioned that. We also have discovered there's a Louisiana representative who discovered huge maps that the EPA had drawn that were totally refined out to little tiny streams and little tricklets and even marshy areas. Enormous refined maps of the waters in the western states that EPA had put out in 2014. Well, recently a Louisiana congressman became aware of all those, and he's really raising holy you-know-what on that. And they're saying, oh no, that wasn't to support waters of the United States. Oh no, that's just to clarify things. That's just to clarify things. But we've had folks like Andy Johnson in Wyoming, he had 10 acres. And he built a stock pond certified by the state of Wyoming for a few cattle. And the EPA came knocking on his door and said, you have to remove that stock pond and put everything back in its order. And it's going to be a $37,000 a day fine until you do. And his stock pond was many, many miles from the nearest little tricklet that would float into a river, you know. Andy and the Pacific Legal Foundation, and Andy had some good support, and the Pacific Legal Foundation cleaned EPA's clock with that one, you know. But that's the aggressiveness of EPA and those little refined maps that are just coming after everything. And EPA has not really entitled or authorized to come onto private property. When the Clean Water Act and all the environmental acts came out from Congress in the early 1970s, the mandate was upon the states. So every state agency has an environmental agency. They're the ones that are supposed to stay in compliance with the congressional acts, the states. So if the state has a problem, or the state is out of compliance, or a property owner is doing something wrong, that really should be the state's role. But under the last 8 years, EPA just came rolling out over the states, bypassing the states onto the private properties, raising holy hell and terrifying people. The Bureau of Land Management did similar things. The Bureau of Land Management, under their preservation of, under NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection Act, and protecting artifacts and whatnot, they raided prominent people in Montana and in Utah for having little rinky-dink artifacts, some of which weren't even Indian. But they took SWAT teams into the residential areas of a very substantial physician in Utah, as an example, into his home, told him he had illegally appropriated some artifacts, told him he was going to lose his medical license, told him it was going to be something thousand a day, and that he was going to be criminally charged. And he suicided that night. That night. And he was the third or fourth until Senator Orrin Hatch, I said enough's enough, and backed the BLM off of the bizarre, terrorist tactics they were doing under NAGPRA. That has settled down substantially because they were forced to do that. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the Bundy issue, the Bundy and Hammond issue, taking the grazing. This kind of goes to a couple of things down there. But underneath all that was land that Senator Reid was promising to China, I believe it was. Yes. It was a foreign country to come in and build huge wind farms. They just needed to run the cattlemen off first. And one of the things that Obama did, that no other president did, when we had September 11th, 2011, in 2001, and a couple of years later came out with the Homeland Security Act, that act included a clause where the executive branch could militarize otherwise benign agencies if a national issue was required. Bush never signed that. He never militarized otherwise benign agencies like the Department of Education, USDA, BLM. Obama militarized all of them. All of them. We should only have our military forces, the Navy, Army, Air Force, etc. We should not have SWAT teams, tanks, AK-47s, camouflage, and all these federal employees of otherwise benign agencies terrorizing American people one state after another, and driving people off their lands, bankrupting them into foreclosure or years of legal fees. We're a country in trouble. And one of the quickest, fastest ways to make it even worse is water. It changed with the election of 2016, but it didn't stop. I like to use the analogy of a big Amtrak train. When that engineer hits the brakes, it doesn't stop on a dime. There's a lot of forward momentum. And we're in a period of time right now, in my view, where the Trump administration is beginning to rein things in, taking the harder look. But there's this forward momentum from the last 8 years, and there's this effort to get everything they can while they can. And as an example of that, there's an article, it's a law journal article out of Arizona State University, and it's written by Lance Morgan. And every time I speak of this, I get angry all over again. Lance Morgan is a very nationally prominent attorney, faculty at the Arizona Law School, consults with literally hundreds of tribes. And he wrote a law journal article called The Rise of Tribal Law and the Fall of Indian Law. And so that sounded interesting to me, so I printed it out and read it off. And I was just stunned. Number one, this is written by an attorney. Number two, the whole theme of this law journal article is encouraging tribes to write their own tribal laws, just expand their own tribal laws. Don't worry about federal Indian law. Don't worry about complying with federal Indian law. Don't worry about court rulings, because they can't sue you anyway. And he's saying, take your economic resources, write new tribal laws, and ramp yourself up to be an economy, and spreading the takeover of tribal lands and fall out of state jurisdiction. This is an attorney saying the United States and its laws and regulations are irrelevant for you tribes. Don't worry about it, because they can't sue you. He says most aren't paying attention, and they can't sue you. Well, Mr. Morgan is in for it. You know what I mean? I'm going to be writing and speaking about that article. I encourage you to Google it. Again, it's The Rise of Tribal Law and the Fall of Indian Law. And it's a thumb in the eye to the Constitution, to the United States, to the judicial rulings, to any regulation. It's go your own way to these quasi-dependent sovereign tribes. These quasi-dependent tribes that want to become their own nations with the United Nations. 567 of them on 340 major reservations in just the lower 48 states. So how does this play out? I like to use Washington State as an example because in my view, and I lived for 16 years on the Yakima. I loved living in Tompkins, Washington. I loved living on the reservation. But when the Yakima tribe got its casino, life changed real quick and fast. And that was my entry into what is this thing called federal Indian policy? And I've been researching ever since. But Washington State now has 31 tribes. We all know how the state, we all know, we're aware of the visual map of the United States. We know exactly what Washington State's boundaries look like. They have never changed since statehood, and they never will. Washington State cannot go take land from Idaho or Oregon or Canada. Washington has a fixed state for its sovereignty and for meeting the needs of all Washington State citizens and for protecting Washington State resources like water. So we now have 31 within this bounded area of Washington State which cannot grow. We have 31 tribes, all of which are gaming and using those big gaming dollars to acquire more land, all of whose reservations are growing incrementally each year within this fixed state that cannot grow. And the political power, when you add another piece into this, tribal governments since 2000 are the only governments in the country that can write a check directly to a political candidate or incumbent or challenger or a political party. They write them to both. Tribal governments can have an inordinate control over your elected officials with those political contributions. They put elected officials in a bit of a box because the elected official that receives that money had better do that bidding, because if they don't, they'll just run a challenger up and take him out. And so it's an awkward, it's monetary handcuffs when elected officials are taking contributions from tribal governments in a state whose land and resources are fixed, in a state whose 31 tribes, the land bases and resources and authorities are just escalating. That elected official is no longer able to abide by his oath of office to the U.S. and Washington State Constitution, and is beholden to the tribal policies and whims. That has captured Olympia, exception being the wonderful legislators in this room, and there's several others. I know Jim Honeyford, Senator Jim, on the Yakima. I lived there 16 years. I worked very much with Senator Jim Honeyford, Representative Bruce Chandler, and Dan Newhouse before he went to Congress. There are some marvelous elected officials who are very, very brave, and there are some who've never taken a dime from a tribal government, but the majority in Olympia has. And your governors since Lowry have. And backing up to Lowry, he is the one who started this process. In 1988, I think it was 1987. It was on the centennial anniversary of Washington's statehood. 89. Okay, 89. That's right. It was 1 year after 1988 when the Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and said, these tribes need an economy. They need to have a way to become self-sufficient, self-determination. So they gave them gaming in 1988. Lowry saw that coming and when the centennial, the statehood's anniversary of 1989 came up, he came up with a Centennial Accord. And he created in that accord a trust relationship between the state of Washington and its tribes. Now the federal government has a trust relationship ordered by the Supreme Court in the 1830s. The federal government has a trust relationship, but no states did. But Lowry comes up with a Centennial Accord, tucks in this trust relationship, and establishes an Indian office in all the state agencies, smelling that gaming money coming their way, you know?
Wow.
And so they're off to the races. Now, Lowry was so proud of that he took his Centennial Accord into Clinton. And Clinton used it as a model for Executive Order 13175, which created an Indian agency in every one of the federal agencies. So think about this. We had only the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs managing and funding all of the tribes. Lowry trots the Centennial Accord into Clinton, who does this executive order. Now we have 29 federal agencies who are budgeting and managing and sending funds out to 567 tribes every year. It's enormous. And it's insidious when you consider there isn't a single word. There's no point, there is not a single word in our U.S. Constitution where the founders ever contemplated tribal governments. All of this, absolutely all of this, is unconstitutional. And all of this is ripping to shreds the respect and integrity and sovereign authority of states, which is no longer able to hold its own with the federal government. We're losing that balance. Our Constitution has 3 sovereignties in it, and they're in order. And the first one is individual sovereignty, we the people. That's the first sovereignty in the Constitution. It's yours and mine. The second sovereignty is the state's authority, because there was no federal government. The states came together and created the Constitution and created the United States, the federal government. So the state's sovereignty is second in order, in priority. And the third sovereignty was the sovereignty with limited enumerated powers of the new federal government. So first was you and me, we the people. Second, state authority and sovereignty. Third, the United States limited and enumerated powers. It's completely upside down today, isn't it? It's just completely upside down. The federal government and the entrenched bureaucrats have rolled over states. And in the western states, it's easy to understand. So much of the western lands are federal lands. And the Indian reservations are federal lands, the trust land. And states are very dependent upon federal funding. And so states are quite willing to comply with all federal funding. States are, I don't know of many states that say, hey, never mind, we don't want your federal dollars, we're going to be a state. We'll do it ourselves. I haven't heard of that. They're dependent on the federal dollars, and they've lost great percentages of their, or they've never had great percentages of their lands and their own natural resources because it's federal lands. So it's easy to see how the tipping point started. And this whole federal bureaucracy is pounding out state sovereignty. Well, that first sovereignty, the individual sovereignty, that is the source of our property rights. And water is a property. That is the source, our individual sovereignty. The situation in Washington State, I'm being kind of stark, but I think it's true. And I have a feeling those of you who live in the Puget Sound area, up and down the western side of Washington State, I think you understand it, more so than the folks on the eastern side, although they have their problems too. The tribal governments, through their treaties, which should have been gone in 1871, their treaties and their fishing rights and their ability to hunt and fish and have some jurisdiction over lands ceded and paid for by these tribes, they have today become overlords in this system, in this state. And by that I mean it's transitioning from a state, put in place under the Constitution when a certain population was established, it becomes a state with all the rights and sovereignty of the state. Today, you have these tribal systems and federal systems and partner with the international systems, and you have a state that is being overwhelmed and incrementally taken down, and it can't grow. And unless it fights back, it will go. It's very hard to get a state, even a county commission, even city councils, to fight back. Couple of different reasons. One's the money, the political money that's purchasing some of these elected officials, and the other is who wants to be called a racist. You say no to any tribal women, boy, you're a racist. You know, that's an enormous problem. It hasn't been for me because, and I don't even know where I get this from. My folks are not political, none of my family, none of my relatives. You know, it was like, what's for dinner? You know, I come from middle class folks from the South and whatnot, and I don't know where this comes from within me, but it's in the center of me, and that is my individual sovereignty, my thoughts. I have my thoughts, I have my speech, I have my right to assembly, and you can call me any name you want to, but I have those, and I'm going to keep on talking. You know what I mean? That's where all of us need to get. This political correctness is another heavy piece that is handcuffing our elected officials, the people we elect, who probably want to do much better. But the political correctness, the money, the name calling, and the enormous power of bureaucracy that is overloaded. We hear that, you know, we've got some of those old-timers in the Senate and in Congress, and probably some old-timers in Olympia, and we hear that, we think in terms of, oh, we need term limits, they've been there too long. Well, I read a wonderful book and then listened to an interview of a fellow named Benjamin Ginsberg. No relationship to Justice Ginsburg. But Benjamin Ginsberg is an economist and an analyst and a politician, and he's very well known. And he said, most people think that the Senate and Congress are the old-timers, that they run the country. He says the executive branch does not run this country, the Senate does not, nor the House. He said the average length of term of service of a senator or congressman, this is among the 535, the average length of time is 8 years. And that's also the average length of time of the president. The average length of time of a bureaucrat employee in a federal agency is 24 years. They just tolerate the president's coming and going. They just tolerate congressmen. They have their own independent cultures. And under Obama, they went rogue and armed. And they just came down on the western states. And so that's the dilemma we're fighting. When you put somebody in who's a change agent and who's fearless, you strike terror in the folks that had all this squared away. Presidents come and go, Congress come and go. We and our international forces, George Soros, the international, the One World Order gang, the globalists, they're taking down America, coming right after America. They've been after it for a while, and they've really gained some ground. But we went to the polls in November. We've slammed back hard on the NFL. We even put old Judge Roy Moore in office. And we're getting busy. And that's my message to CAPR, because you're mature, you're 15 years old, you're chapters, and you need to, I hope you grow more chapters, and you're interactive. You're interactive with each other, you're interactive with your legislators, you do your homework, you show up at commission meetings, city council meetings. You guys are doing great work. I would just add that continue talking not just amongst yourselves, to your kids, to your neighbors, to your co-workers, to everybody who will listen, and bring them into this activism. Because I don't think Washington State can save itself. It's going to take citizen litigation, holding the state as a defendant for abdicating its authority and its protections over Washington residents. I don't believe that the Washington legislature or any recent and current Washington governor is going to fix this. You know, I just don't think so. It's just the people that live here and that would like their kids to be able to live here with maybe some water on their land. You know? Just incredible. Individual sovereignty is the fulcrum of property rights. Property absent water is useless, as we all know. And we just have to work harder and harder. Now, there's a few little things you're going to hear about that you just have to just say, oh no you don't. There are several things in play here that have fomented and escalated this expansion of tribalism as a governing system in the United States. One of them is a new definition of Indian country. Indian country is defined in a criminal statute, 1151, and Indian country is basically federal trust lands with Indian, stops there. Federal Indian trust lands, you know. But the new definition, this came out of the former administration and it hasn't been ratcheted back yet, but it's not, we're all, across the country, we're fighting. The new definition of Indian country is anywhere their ancestors walked, or if they think that's if they think it was their ancestors' land, then it's Indian country. It goes far off reservations, far off of feed trust. So you're hearing this new buzz about Indian country, and it's linking up to Agenda 2030 in the UN thing. That is a hot topic that we're pushing back on. There's another thing that would pretty much take this down, and that is the delegation of authority. Only Congress has the authority to recognize Indian tribes. Only Congress has the trust relationship with Indian tribes, and Congress has a limited ability to delegate authority, which Congress has done to all those secretaries of Interior, including the current one. And that delegation of authority is highly questionable. The Secretary of Interior has authority over the Bureau of Indian Affairs and it can make some decisions on behalf of tribes, but the delegation of authority is saying the Secretary of Interior does not have the authority to federally recognize a new Indian tribe. It never did. But somehow we went from 65 tribes in 1934 to 567 and today, exploding after gaming. We have tribes and reservations in California, huge casinos, 3 members in the tribe, you know, huge casinos, buying land all around those casinos with the gaming money and creating reservations in California. And they were never appropriately or legally recognized as tribes. But they're there, they're in our face, and we're dealing with them. Another one that has happened and it affects us directly on the Flathead Indian Reservation is the root origin of the Secretary of Interior's authority. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was initially under the Department of War in the 1840s and 50s. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was under the Department of War, and the Department of War's definition of Indian country then, that's the root origin of it, was wherever there are roaming hostile Indians in the western states. They're trying to settle the West, and wherever there were hostile tribes roaming, there was no geographic area. There was no boundary, like over there is Indian country. No, it's wherever the hostile Indians were moving and the cavalry needed to go, and they were authorized under the Department of War. They were authorized under a war power for the cavalry to go out and intercede in hostile actions between tribes, or shenanigans between tribes and settlers. That was all under the Department of War for many years, and then it moved into the Department of Interior. That war power followed to the Department of Interior. So figure this. When a tribe buys a property, top market rate, and takes it off the tax rolls, puts it into federal trust, and the United States takes that piece of ground from that state and owns it, the authority under that is a war power. Now, war power is only operable in territories, and most of our western states in those days were territories. War power works in Puerto Rico, it works in our territories. Once a state is at statehood, the federal government may not implement or execute a war power against that state. And that is the root authority under fee to trust. That is the root authority taking lands out of a state's tax base and transferring it to the United States. And that is being challenged in the courts right now, and we're getting closer and closer. Am I running short on time?
You are right at the end.
Oh, okay. Now here's what I would like you to write. Here's what I would like you to write down. Regulations.gov. Regulation. I would like to challenge all the CAPR chapters. I would like to challenge each member of CAPR. Go on to regulations.gov. And I'm a technical nerd, so I have to kind of fish around. Excuse me. President Trump, in March, came up with an executive order saying we are doing massive regulatory reform. We're going after those 24-year-old timers in the federal agencies who are just running the country. We're going after massive regulatory reform. June 22nd of this year, the Department of Interior posted on behalf of all the agencies in compliance with Trump's executive order for regulatory reform. They set up a website, regulations.gov. It is so user-friendly. It is just so user-friendly. And in that June 22nd regulation, they said the purpose of this website is because we want to hear from the citizens. Wow. This is Trump's executive order being implemented by way of regulations.gov. We want to hear from the citizens how any federal regulations burden you. Ta-da! Well, just a few. I really want to encourage, it's very little known, and there's not much activity on it. I put Lance Morgan's Rise of Tribal Law, I put it on there. It says, and every Congress, they send that through your Interior section, and please forward it to the White House. When you have an attorney telling tribal governments to thumb your nose at the law, at the court, you know, something that needs to come to everybody's attention. So I really want to encourage you to do regulations.gov. I have one more thing I'm going to close with. Okay. I did this many years ago, but it's certainly true today. It was a few years after, I think it was about the third or fourth year of the former president. It's a little thing called If I Don't Speak. If I don't speak, will you? If you don't speak, then who? Bondage is creeping over me. I feel less and less and less free. If I don't speak, will you? If you don't speak, then who? When insidious harm slithers along the pathway to our homes, towns, and country. When class wars, race wars, and transfers of power away from the people and our precious Constitution morphs into an indentured institution, sending us roaring back to monarchy days. The king is dead in America and must remain so. The citizen is sovereign. Our silence is our surrender. Our voice is our victory. If I don't speak, will you? If you don't speak, then who? Thank you very, very much. Just two important pieces that I neglected to mention. One regarding the Columbia River Treaty. That is coming up around 2020, and the treaty between Canada and the United States. There are 57 tribes organizing as of 4 years ago that are already preparing their strategies for their influence over the negotiations between Canada and the United States. And they have determined that their goal is to require both nations, Canada and the United States, to fulfill its moral obligation to turn over all the waters of the Columbia River to the indigenous tribes. They're 4 years, 57 tribes, 4 years ahead of any other activity with the state. So that's something CAPR should really be engaging in and tracking. The second piece is all your major watersheds. You have a federal drawn by the Army Corps of Engineers, like the Columbia River, the Missouri River, Snake River. They all have a major bounded area watershed boundary for every little trickle. And then they have a guidance board, a management board for, say, the Missouri River watershed. And there's one representative for each state and one for each tribe. Within the Missouri River watershed, 9 states each have a representative, 27 tribes have a representative. That's the management board. And they have already altered what used to be primary agriculture and economy as the priorities of those watersheds. It's now cultural resources and indigenous things. 27 representatives of the tribe on one thing and 9 states. The Columbia River only impacts 4 states. It has 4 seats, one from each state, and 57 tribal members on the Columbia River. So imagine the power that these tribes have on the Columbia River. And they too have altered the priorities of that rivershed. So I just forgot to mention that in my previous talk. Thank you.